Thank you, Brother Paul, for your prayer. So in order to prepare us for the class this evening, we've asked our Brother Dave Gadbury to read for us 1st of Chronicles chapter 13.
1 Chronicles 13. And David consulted with the captains of thousands and hundreds, and with every leader. And David said unto all the congregation of Israel, if it seem good unto you, that it be of the Lord our God, let us send abroad unto our brethren everywhere that are left in all the land of Israel, and with them also the priests and the Levites, which are in their cities and suburbs, that they may gather themselves unto us. And let us bring again the ark of our God to us, for we inquired not at it in the days of Saul. And all the congregation said that they would do so, for the thing was right in the eyes of all the people. So David gathered all Israel together from Shihor of Egypt, even unto the entering of Hamath, to bring the ark of God from Kirjath-jearim. And David went up, and all Israel, to Bela, that is to Kirjath-jearim, which belongeth to Judah, to bring up thence the ark of God, the Lord, that dwelleth between the cherubims, whose name is called on it. And they carried the ark of God in a new cart out of the house of Abinadab, and Uzzah and Ahio drave the cart. David and all Israel played before God with all their might, and singing, and with harps, and with psalteries, and with timbrels, and with cymbals, and with trumpets. When they came unto the threshing floor of Chidon, Uzzah put forth his hand to hold the ark, for the oxen stumbled. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and he smote him because he put his hand to the ark. There he died before God. And David was displeased because the Lord had made a breach upon Uzzah. Therefore that place is called Perez Uzzah to this day. And David was afraid of God that day, saying, how shall I bring the ark of God home to me? So David brought not the ark home to himself, the city of David, but carried it aside to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. And the ark of God remained with the family of Obed-Edom in his house 3 months. And the Lord blessed the house of Obed-Edom and all that he had.
Thank you, Brother Dave, for your reading. At this time, we'll give our kind and careful attention as Brother Roger delivers us his address on the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. Brother Roger. He was on while we were just before we started singing. While we wait for the Roger, I had a couple announcements quickly. Then
does that sound better?
Oh, there we go. Now we can hear you.
Good. Well, welcome to everyone on the other side of the world. We're just coming into our winter season now, entering into autumn, and we've just had start my video. Just hang on. I wondered whether that was the case. Here we go. How does that sound? Does that look better? Excellent. So tonight then, our study is, as Brother Dan has mentioned, the story of Obed-Edom the Gittite, who's referred to here in this chapter, the 1st of Chronicles 13. And it's interesting that what we really have, I think, in this chapter is what we might describe as a study in contrasts, because we have two men who stand in relation to the ark. The one, his association brought about his death, and in the other, his association with the ark would enrich his life. So the breach of Uzzah and the blessing of Obed-Edom were polar opposites, and they could really only be explained by a fundamental difference in their attitude. The breach of Uzzah was a tragedy, really, wasn't it, brothers and sisters, because a man was struck down by God, the journey of the ark was disrupted, the king was left in mortal fear, and in his uncertainty, the record tells us here in the 1st of Chronicles 13, and verse 13, so David brought not the ark home to himself, to the city of David, but carried it aside into the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. Now, it was suggested a long time ago in J.J. Blunt's book, Undesigned Coincidences, that the phrase Obed-Edom the Gittite, meaning someone who belongs to Gath, was a reference perhaps to Gath Rimmon, which was a city of the Levites and a city of the Kohathites in particular. And since we're told in the last verse of this chapter that Yahweh blessed the house of Obed-Edom, the conclusion was drawn that perhaps Obed-Edom had been blessed because he was a Kohathite. This was the place where the ark should have been, and certainly the people who should have carried the ark, and that perhaps this is the clue to the enigma of why Obed-Edom was blessed. And if you come to chapter 15, just for a moment, it seems that that is the case, because we're told in 1 Chronicles 15 and verse 2, the record says, "Then David said, none ought to carry the ark of God but the Levites, for them hath Yahweh chosen to carry the ark of God and to minister unto him forever." And so it would seem to be that that suggestion is perhaps a sensible one, that Obed-Edom was an inhabitant of one of the Kohathite cities, and he was blessed because the ark of God had now come to rest among the Levites, who should have been carrying it all along. But there is another explanation, and in its fullness, this explanation might provide, I think, an even more powerful lesson from this story, and one which we can take great personal encouragement from. And that interpretation rests on the idea that Obed-Edom was in fact a Gentile and not a Jew. And if that be the case, then it dramatically alters the significance of the passage. Now, there were three places, at least three places in the Old Testament record that were known as Gath. There was Gath Hepher in Zebulun in 2 Kings 14 verse 25. There was Gath Rimmon in Dan in Joshua 21 verses 23 and 24. And there was Gath Philistia in Judah in the 1st of Samuel chapter 7 and verse 14. These were all places known as Gath, but the last of those was the most famous, the most well-known, Gath of Philistia. So when we come to the term Gittite, as we've got it here in 1st of Chronicles 13 verse 13, meaning an inhabitant of Gath, it should be the context which decides which Gath might be referred to. But here's the interesting thing, you see, brothers and sisters, is that every other use of this term in Scripture outside of the 1st of Chronicles 13, that phrase, the Gittite, refers without exception to Gath of Philistia, to Gath of the Philistines. Now, come and have a look at them, because there's not too many. It's just a handful. If you come back to Joshua chapter 13, we're told this in that record. It says in Joshua chapter 13 and verse 3, it says from maybe verse 2 for connection, "This is the land that yet remaineth, all the borders of the Philistines, from Sihor, which is before Egypt, even unto the border of Ekron northward, which is counted to the Canaanite, 5 lords of the Philistines, the Gazathites, the Ashtathites, the Eshkelonites, the Gittites, and the Ekronites, and also the Avites." So the Gittite of Joshua 13 and verse 3 could only refer to Gath of Philistia. Here's the second passage. It's in the 2nd of Samuel and chapter 15. It concerns that moment of time when David fled from Jerusalem because of the rebellion of Absalom, his son. And the record says in 2 Samuel 15, these words in verse 18. It says, "And all his servants passed on beside him, and all the Kerethites and all the Pelethites." Now, many of you will know that the Kerethites and the Pelethites are a reference to David's elite troops, his personal bodyguard. And that personal bodyguard, brothers and sisters, were of Philistine descent. The Cherethites and the Pelethites were of Philistine descent. And then the record says and with them all the Gittites, 600 men, which came after him from Gath, that passed on before the king. And those Gittites that joined his Philistine bodyguards in 2 Samuel 15, verse 18, were clearly from Gath of Philistia, and they're called Gittites. And here's the next one, and in the very next verse, verse 19, then said the king to Ittai the Gittite, wherefore goest thou with us? Return to thy place and abide with the king, for thou art a stranger and also an exile. Whereas thou camest but yesterday, should I this day make thee go up and down with us? Seeing I go whither I may, return thou and take back thy brethren, it says. So Ittai the Gittite of verse 19, his brethren were the Gittites of verse 18 who had come from Gath. Ittai the Gittite was clearly a man from Gath in Philistia. And now come to the first of Chronicles, chapter 20 and verse 5. There's a parallel record in 2 Samuel, but we're going to take the Chronicles one. The first of Chronicles, chapter 20, verse 5. And we're told there, in the matter of the family of Goliath, the record says, and there was war again with the Philistines, and Elhanan the son of Jair slew Lahmi, the brother of Goliath, the Gittite, whose spear staff was like a weaver's beam. So here's a man of Israel who slays Lahmi, the brother of Goliath the Gittite. And both Goliath and his brothers were clearly men from Gath in Philistia. Now come back to the first of Chronicles in chapter 13, because they are the only other references to the word Gittite, apart from this one here, when it says in first of Chronicles 13 and verse 13 that David brought the ark and carried it aside into the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. So when it says here that Obed-Edom was a Gittite, the weight of scriptural evidence behind that term would indicate that he was by birth a Philistine. And yet it's into the house of this man that David brought the ark in his time of crisis. Now, David obviously knew Obed-Edom, and it was probably the king's friendship that had brought this man into the truth. In fact, what's interesting is that David was just that sort of man, like Abraham of old, who made friends wherever he went and brought them into the truth. He brought them into a covenant relationship. The history of David is filled with examples of Gentiles whom he turned to God and who became his trusted associates. In fact, come and have a look just a couple of pages back. In the first of Chronicles, chapter 11, do you notice amongst his list of mighty men are these? Among David's mighty men, first of Chronicles, chapter 11, verse 39, Zelek the Ammonite, or verse 41, Uriah the Hittite, or verse 46 at the end of the verse, Ithmar the Moabite. So amongst David's mighty men is an Ammonite and a Hittite and a Moabite. David brought all these Gentiles into covenant relationship with Israel. So there was nothing strange about David having a friendship and an association with Obed-Edom, the Philistine from Gath, Obed-Edom the Gittite. In fact, I think there is a moment in David's life, brothers and sisters, when these two might have met. Because if you come back to the first of Samuel, chapter 27, we're told of a circumstance in the life of David the king, where this might well have been the occasion where Obed-Edom came into contact with this man whom he would admire so greatly. This is perhaps the occasion when the two of them met. In the first of Samuel, chapter 27, we're told this in verse 2, and David arose, and he passed over with the 600 men that were with him unto Achish, the son of Maok, king of Gath. And David dwelt with Achish at Gath, he and his men, every man with his household, even David with his two wives, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess and Abigail the Carmelitess, Nabal's wife. And it was told Saul that David was fled to Gath, and he sought no more again for him. And verse 7 says, and the time that David dwelt in the country of the Philistines was a full year and 4 months. So for 16 months, brothers and sisters, David dwelt in Gath itself, in that very Philistine territory. And when he left that place, and we've already seen this in the 2nd of Samuel, chapter 15, verse 18, it says that 600 men of Gath left to follow David and went with him when he departed from that place. And I suggest that amongst those who left was Obed-Edom the Gittite, who joined David's company as a result of David's sojourning among them. This was another of these Gentiles whom David had brought into the truth. And although Obed-Edom might have come from Gath, he obviously didn't live there anymore in the 1st of Chronicles chapter 13. Gath is many, many miles away from the road between Kirjath-Jearim and Jerusalem, where the ark was traveling on this day. See, I think Obed-Edom had left his old way of life down on the Philistine plain, and he now lived up on the hills of the Judean plateau. It was providence that the breach of Uzzah occurred at the threshing floor of Kidon. It was providence that David already knew Obed-Edom as a Gentile proselyte. And it was providence that his house was close to the place where the oxen had stumbled. You see, David couldn't just turn aside to lodge the ark at the first house he could find. Given the disaster that had occurred, fearful as he was of the anger of Yahweh, he was anxious to place the ark in the trust and in the care of someone who could be trusted. And right there, near at hand, was a man he knew personally, who was an example of extraordinary faithfulness before God. He might have been a Philistine by birth, but by spirit, he was an Israelite indeed. Now, coming back to the 1st of Chronicles chapter 13, notice now what the record says when David did turn aside and place the ark of God in this man's house. We're told these words. 1st of Chronicles 13 verse 14 says that having carried it aside into the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite, it says the ark of God remained with the family of Obed-Edom in his house 3 months. And Yahweh blessed the house of Obed-Edom and all that he had. Actually, the parallel record in 2 Samuel 6 verse 11 says, and Yahweh blessed Obed-Edom and all his household. So question, why was his family and his whole household blessed? It can't have been simply because the ark came to rest in his house. The mere depositing of the ark wasn't a key to the divine blessing. It was his attitude to it. It was his standard of reverence. It was his spirit of devotion. It was his sense of guardianship. This man was so intent on preserving the sacred trust of the Ark of the Presence that he became its protector, its defender, to the delight of Yahweh Elohim of Israel. There was no breach here. Only a faithful keeping of the threshold of the sanctuary, the place of God's ark, which for this brief moment, for these 3 months, would reside at his house. In fact, the record says, does it not? And Yahweh blessed the house of Obed-Edom. So in what way then do you think Obed-Edom was blessed and all his household that appertained to him? Well, I suggest it was the blessing of Psalm 128. And we're going to suggest this for a reason that shall become clear by and by as our story unfolds. But you'll remember these words in this lovely psalm. Yahweh blessed the household of Obed-Edom. Well, here's what Psalm 128 says, and I suggest this was the very blessing that had occurred in this household. Blessed is everyone that feareth Yahweh, that walketh in his ways. For thou shalt eat the labour of thine hands. Happy shalt thou be, and it shall be well with thee. Thy wife shall be as a fruitful vine by the sides of thine house. thy children like olive plants round about thy table. Behold, thus shall the man be blessed that feareth Yahweh. Yahweh shall bless thee out of Zion, and thou shalt see the good of Jerusalem all the days of thy life. Yea, thou shalt see thy children's children, and peace upon Israel. And whatever the blessing was of the first of Chronicles, chapter 13 and verse 14, whatever happened, there were signs already evident within the cycle of just 3 moons that Yahweh had prospered this family, as we shall discover in the record shortly. And that sign, incidentally, of the blessing of the house of Obed-Edom was the stimulus to faith which David needed now to complete his work. He knew, did he not, brothers and sisters, how badly he had strayed from the divine standard. This was something that Yahweh could not and did not permit. But the blessing of God upon Obed-Edom told David that it was not the movement of the ark to Zion that brought divine disapproval, but the manner of its carriage. Now, what's interesting is that when David had understood all this and went about the carriage on a second occasion, that Obed-Edom will turn up in the record on David's second endeavor. In fact, there are going to be 2 Obed-Edoms mentioned in David's second attempt, and we believe that one of them was Obed-Edom the Gittite. Now, that record is found in the First of Chronicles chapter 15. If you come to the First of Chronicles 15, we're told this in verses 17 and 18. Here's the first of 2 Obed-Edoms who will appear in this record. It says in First of Chronicles 15 and verse 17, the Levites appointed Heman, the son of Joel, and of his brethren Asaph, the son of Berechiah, and of the sons of Merari, their brethren Ethan, and with them their brethren of the second degree. And then we have a list of names, and almost towards the end, one of those brethren of second degree that's mentioned, which, by the way, is a phrase indicating that these were subordinate to the 3 great choir leaders, but there will be an Obed-Edom in this marching of singers in verses 17 and 18, those that will lead the praise. And that Obed-Edom mentioned in verse 18 is the same man who in verse 21 will be playing upon a harp amongst the Sheminith or male choir, Obed-Edom and Jeiel and Azaziah, with harps on the Sheminith to excel. That's the same man as verse 18, brothers and sisters. He's amongst the singers. But there's another Obed-Edom in this story, because when the ark came on its journey on this second occasion, we notice in verse 23 that there were 2 doorkeepers or porters that marched before the ark, Berechiah and Elkanah. But at the end of verse 24, there will be 2 doorkeepers or porters who will march behind the ark, Obed-Edom and Jehiah. 2 marched at the front, 2 marched at the back. Now, who's the Obed-Edom, do you think, of verse 24, brothers and sisters? Because it's not the same man as the one in verse 18 and verse 21. He's in the middle of one of the choirs. He can't be the Obed-Edom now that marches behind the ark as its guard. But how appropriate it would have been for David to salute the integrity and the faithfulness of his friend Obed-Edom the Gittite by asking him to become one of the guardians of the ark from the moment it left his house on its final journey to Jerusalem. And given that it was Obed-Edom's faithfulness that made possible this day now that they could finally bring the ark up to Zion, who in Israel would have challenged the presence of Obed-Edom the Gittite as a porter on that day? Oh yes, brothers and sisters, I think the man of verse 24 who marches behind the ark to take it safely to Jerusalem is the man of verse 25. So David and the elders of Israel and the captains over thousands went up to bring the ark of the covenant of Yahweh out of the house of Obed-Edom. And not only will they bring it out of his house, brothers and sisters, but Obed-Edom himself will be chosen by David to walk behind the ark as one of its guarding porters on this last journey. So was it this man, do you think, brothers and sisters? Well, I think so. I think the record tells us that it was indeed Obed-Edom the Gittite who walked into Jerusalem because he was asked by David, having walked there, to remain in that same capacity as a porter of the ark ever after in Jerusalem. And we know that because that's what the very next chapter in Chronicles tells us. Now, do you notice in 1 Chronicles 16, you'll remember that this is the story of David bringing the ark, offering sacrifices, blessing all the people with a loaf of bread, a good piece of flesh, and a flagon of wine, appointing the house of Asaph to sing the song of praise. But when all of that was over, that wonderful special day was over, we're told this in verse 37. So he left there before the ark of the covenant of Yahweh, Asaph and his brethren, to minister before the ark continually, as every day's work required, and also there left behind was Obed-Edom with their brethren 80, Obed-Edom also the son of Jeduthun and Hosah to be porters. Now, Rotherham's renders the first phrase of verse 38 this way, and I think correctly so, and Obed-Edom with his brethren 68. And the second Obed-Edom is named to distinguish him from the first. But the crucial meaning of this verse, following on from verse 37, is that this first Obed-Edom with his brethren 68 was placed in Jerusalem with the singers of the house of Asaph to guard the thresholds of the tabernacle of David in Zion. All the other singers, all the other porters were sent to minister at the tabernacle of Moses in Gibeon. Says that, doesn't it? Verse 39, Zadok the priest and his brethren before the tabernacle of Yahweh in the high places that were at Gibeon. And with them, verse 41, Heman and Jeduthun, verse 42, and with them Heman and Jeduthun and cymbals that should make a sound with musical instruments, and the sons of Jeduthun were porters. Everyone else was at Gibeon, brothers and sisters. Only the house of Asaph stayed in Jerusalem to sing before the ark, and only Obed-Edom with his brethren 68 stayed to be the porters before the ark. Now you see, this first Obed-Edom of verse 38 is, we believe, Obed-Edom the Gittite, in whose house the ark rested. And you notice again that unlike the second man called Obed-Edom here, that his ancestry is not given. He's simply Obed-Edom with his brothers, because he's got no nation, he's got no lineage in the nation of Israel. He was a Gittite, he was a Philistine. Only in his lifetime had he become associated with the people of Israel. But this is the man that David trusted, and the man whom David sought to watch over the Ark of the Covenant in the tabernacle of David. He became in spirit a Levite, a gatekeeper, a porter, a guardian of the threshold in safeguarding the ark. And there was greater significance to this appointment than might have been realized. You see, what this chapter tells us is that there were 2 tents and 2 tabernacles. One was the tabernacle of Moses in Gibeon, verse 39, with all the vessels of Moses and the altar of burnt offering. The other was the tabernacle of David in verse 1, wherein was a new altar and the ark of God. The first tabernacle in Gibeon stood for the old covenant of the law. And ministering in that place were the singers of Heman and Jeduthun and the porters of Kohath and Merari. The second tabernacle in Zion stood for the new covenant and the worship of Yahweh in spirit and truth. Only the singers of the house of Asaph stood before it to minister in praise. And who were the porters for the tabernacle of David? Why, the family of Obed-Edom, who alone were the guardians of its thresholds. Now, what an honorable and exalted position to hold as a Gentile. Now, you see, this episode happened when David first brought the ark to Zion. But notice now the arrangements for the temple system, which David finalized shortly before his death, which is 30 years later, 30 years after the first of Chronicles 16. And those details, those arrangements are given to us in the first of Chronicles chapter 26. 30 years later, here are the arrangements that David put in place shortly before his death with regard to the matter of the arrangement of the porters in the temple of Solomon that would be to come. Now, notice carefully what the record says, 1 Chronicles 26, verse 1, concerning the division of the porters of the Korhites. Now, Korhites is a reference to the Levitical branch of the Kohathites, but through the sons of Korah. Of the Korhites was Meshelemiah, the son of Korah, of the sons of Asaph. So the first division of the porters were Kohathites through this man called Meshelemiah. And verse 2 says the sons of Meshelemiah were Zechariah, the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, the seventh, verse 3. And then down in verse 9, notice it goes on to say, in conclusion, and Meshelemiah had sons and brethren, strong men, in total 18. 18 sons of the household of the Kohathites through Meshelemiah. And then there was a second group of porters mentioned in verse 10, also Hosah of the children of Merari had sons. Simri the chief, for though he was not the firstborn, yet his father made him chief. And then we've got the second, the third, the fourth, all the sons and brethren of Hosah, verse 11, verse 13. So what we've got is a set of porters from the Kohathites in verse 1, and a set of porters from the Merarites in verse 10. But there are no porters in the line of Gershon mentioned. But in between these two groups of Levitical porters, we have another group of porters mentioned right in the middle. Verse 4, 1 Chronicles 26, verse 4. Moreover, the sons of Obed-Edom were Shemaiah the firstborn, Jehoshaphat the second, Joah the third, Zechariah the fourth, Nethaneel the fifth, and now we will have a list of the sons of Obed-Edom. And you notice again, brothers and sisters, verse 4, there's no lineage or ancestry given for this man, Obed-Edom, because this is the family of Obed-Edom the Gittite, Obed-Edom the Philistine, Obed-Edom the Gentile. He has no lineage, but he's there, prominent amongst the doorkeepers. In fact, you see what the record says about him. Verse 5, Amiel the sixth, Issachar the seventh, Pelutai the eighth, for God blessed him. Now where have we come across that phrase before? Here is a direct reference to the blessing which came upon this man when the ark was in his house for 3 months. This is the first of Chronicles chapter 13 and verse 14. And Yahweh blessed the house of Obed-Edom and all that he had. And now we know, brothers and sisters, in what particular capacity that blessing was involved, because we're told in this chapter that the blessing was indeed the marvelous multiplication of his family. Do you see what it says, verse 8? All these are the sons of Obed-Edom, they and their sons and their brethren, able men for strength for the service, were 62 of Obed-Edom. Do you know that in this list of porters in the first of Chronicles chapter 26, we have 93 porters mentioned. But this one family, just the house of Obed-Edom, will account for 62 of them. 2/3 of all the porters, brothers and sisters, in the temple came from Obed-Edom and his family. A Philistine family guarded the special holiness of the house of God and the sacred treasure of the ark in its midst. How astonishing that that should be the case. And in all that time, David never forgot the faithfulness of his friend Obed-Edom the Gittite. In fact, I think that what 1 Chronicles 26 suggests to us, brothers and sisters, is that just as Caleb was adopted into the tribe of Judah because of his faithfulness, that David joined Obed-Edom the Gittite into the tribe of Levi because of his faithfulness. And he became the greatest of the families of the porters, not only in the time of David, but in the time of Solomon's temple, which was to come. Now, that's interesting because it brings us to an enigmatic but intriguing prophecy in the book of Amos, which you might just recall, because in the book of Amos and chapter 9, we have a reference, do we not, to the tabernacle of David and the restoration of the tabernacle of David in an age yet to come. We might take up the record from verse 8 of Amos chapter 9, just to understand the context in which this promise will come. Amos 9 says in verse 8, "Behold, the eyes of the Lord God are upon the sinful kingdom, and I will destroy it from off the face of the earth, saving that I will not utterly destroy the house of Jacob, saith Yahweh. For lo, I will command, and I will sift the house of Israel among all nations, like as corn is sifted in a sieve, yet shall not the least grain fall upon the earth. All the sinners of my people shall die by the sword, which say the evil shall not overtake or prevent us." So here's a time of coming judgment upon Israel because of their unfaithfulness, because of their wickedness in the sight of God. And now comes the promise, verse 11. "But nevertheless, in that day, a day yet to come, says the prophet, in that day will I raise up the tabernacle of David that has fallen, and close up the breaches thereof, and I will raise up his ruins, and I will build it as in the days of old." So Amos saw a time when the nation of Israel would be rebuilt after the judgments of God had come upon them. And in that restoration, in the end, Israel would take possession of all the surrounding nations until the territory promised to the patriarchs of old was complete. And notice what verse 12 goes on to say: "I'll rebuild the tabernacle of David, that they may possess the remnant of Edom." Now, in the margin of my Bible, it says, see Numbers 24, verse 18, the prophecy of Balaam. And at first sight, that might seem to be an appropriate cross-reference. You'll remember what it says. Numbers 24, verse 18 says, "And Edom shall be for a possession, Seir also a possession for his enemies, and Israel shall do valiantly." But when we examine Amos 9 a little more carefully, I think, brothers and sisters, that we come to the conclusion that the possession of Amos 9 verse 12 is not the possession of conquest, but the possession of conversion. The New King James Version says, "They shall possess the remnant of Edom and all the Gentiles who are called by my name," or literally, "upon whom my name is called." So here was an Israel who would reach out not so much to conquer those around her as to include and embrace them into an Israelitish kingdom who would manifest the name of Yahweh. And it wouldn't be the nation that would do this, it was God's work alone, verse 12, "that they may possess the remnant of Edom, and of all the heathen which are called by my name, saith Yahweh that doeth this. But don't you think, brothers and sisters, that the cameo of all this was Obed-Edom, who as a representative of the heathen became so involved in the cause of the tabernacle of David as to be its faithful guardian, a man upon whom the name of Yahweh was called to indicate his complete and his entire inclusion in the hope of Israel. So how better to symbolize Israel's possession of the remnant of Edom than David's acceptance of a man called the servant of Edom? Did not David possess this one in the best of senses, in that he included him in the very work of the holy tribe of the Levites as he belonged there? Oh yes, brothers and sisters, Amos chapter 9 was a wonderful allusion to the story of Obed-Edom the Gittite. And I think that we have every reason to believe that this was the way that Amos chapter 9 should be read, because we have, do we not, the warrant of an Old Testament, a New Testament commentary to confirm that that is so. And that commentary is found in Acts chapter 15. In the matter of the Jerusalem conference, you will remember how that many of the apostles, many of the elders stood up to give testimony in the debate that had caused such controversy at that time in the ecclesial world. It was a question really concerning the Gentiles, was it not? And when they'd all spoken, verse 13 of Acts 15 says, after they had held their peace, James answered. James, as the chairman, was now going to summarize the results of the conference. And although Peter and Paul and Barnabas had all given evidence of how the Gentiles had responded to the call of the truth, how God had been so evidently at work with them in their labors, now it was going to be left to James to supply a biblical basis to answer the question of the Jerusalem conference about the salvation of the Gentiles. And the clue to his thinking, brothers and sisters, well, he gives it in verse 14. He says, men and brethren, hearken unto me. Simeon hath declared how God at the first did visit the Gentiles to take out of them a people for his name. And that's going to be the clue, you see, to James's summary, a people for God's name, because his answer will now draw on 3 Old Testament passages in succession. Jeremiah chapter 12, verses 14 and 15, Amos chapter 9, verses 11 and 12, and Isaiah 45, verse 21. And the interesting thing is that all 3 of those passages are connected to the name of Yahweh and what it means to belong to the name of Yahweh. But the key quotation that James would use, brothers and sisters, was Amos chapter 9. And notice what it says in his quotation of Amos 9, because it does seem interestingly different to what the Hebrew of Amos says. When James quotes Amos 9, he says in Acts 15, verse 16, after this I will return and will build again the tabernacle of David, which has fallen down, and I will build again the ruins thereof, and I will set it up, that the residue of men might not so much be possessed by Israel, but that they might seek after the Lord. And all the Gentiles, upon whom my name is called, saith the Lord, who doeth all these things. You see, what James saw is that whatever the ultimate fulfillment of the prophecy of Amos might point forward to, that there was an immediate and an appropriate application in his own day that answered the question of the inclusion of the Gentiles. Verse 19, wherefore my sentence is that we trouble not them which from among the Gentiles are turned to God. And as proof would be the power of the passage in Amos chapter 9. Because you see, what Amos chapter 9 really taught, did it not, brothers and sisters, is that there were Gentiles upon whom the name of God was called, and that it was God's sovereign intention all along to include them in his purpose. That's how James will read and use Amos chapter 9. And there could be no better proof that a Gentile could come to God than that amazing moment in Israel's history when a Gittite became a Levite. Don't you think, brothers and sisters? The story of Obed-Edom was the perfect answer in the day of James as to whether a Gentile could be embraced within the covenants of Israelitish hope and promise. And notice also that the Jerusalem conference wasn't just about the inclusion of the Gentiles, but what might be commanded of them to keep. Verse 5, there rose up certain of the sect of the Pharisees which believed, saying it was needful to circumcise them. And when you think about it, James's use of Amos 9 was so powerful when you think that at its heart lay the story of a Gentile, Obed-Edom the Gittite, who not only found acceptance at the tabernacle of David, but who guarded its thresholds as an uncircumcised Philistine. Oh yes, brothers and sisters, don't you think the Spirit overshadowed James on that day? And his scriptural testimony from Amos 9 convinced the whole assembly that here the matter should rest, and that the Gentiles should be included, and that no other requirements concerning circumcision ought to be laid upon them. I think the story of Obed-Edom lies behind that thrilling conclusion in Acts chapter 15. And as those who have been called from among the Gentiles, that example of Obed-Edom, brothers and sisters, is so encouraging to us, is it not? It's the thought of what Peter had already said in Acts chapter 10, of a truth I perceive, that God is no respecter of persons, but in every nation he that feareth him and worketh righteousness is accepted with him. Gentiles can be included in the hope of Israel if their spirit is right before God. And their inclusion in God's purpose was a matter of scriptural prophecy and example. But I think also that the story of Obed-Edom teaches us that blessing will come to those who reverence the presence of God in their midst. You can almost hear the spirit of these words from a hymn, brothers and sisters, in the life of Obed-Edom the Gittite. Wherever, Lord, thy people meet, there they behold thy mercy seat. Where'er they seek thee, thou art found, and every place is hallowed ground. And you see, Obed-Edom hallowed his house to receive the ark of God. It was an unbelievable moment. Can you imagine what that moment must have felt like? Just picture the scene inside the house of Obed-Edom for those 3 months when everyone in his family knew that the ark of God's presence was right there in their home. How would you behave? How would you speak? How would you think? In everything, they were totally conscious, don't you think, of the divine presence? You see, our homes should also be places where the ark of God could lodge. So how do we do that? How do we make our homes a little sanctuary for the presence of God? Well, it happens by observing all the little things that make up a godly house and a godly home. Prayer each day for help that the purpose of God might be outworked in our lives to the glory of his name. Prayer at every meal that we might remember the source of all blessings, including both temporal and material gifts. Prayer every day for forgiveness, that we might come near the mercy seat and seek its healing power. Bible reading every day, that we might constantly remember the holiness of God and strive to remove the unholy and the profane from our lives. Bible reading every day to purify the stream of our thinking so that our perspective remains on the truth. Reminders around our homes that this is a house for God. Our books, our quotations, our pictures, our displays should somewhere in that home include a witness to our hope. You know, 2 generations ago, back to Grandma and Grandpa's time, there used to be in many Christadelphian homes a little plaque on the wall. And that plaque said, "Christ is the head of this house, the unseen guest at every meal, the silent listener to every conversation." As if to say, the ark of God is in this place. Let's continue, brothers and sisters, to make our homes a sanctuary where the presence of God might be. As Gentiles, we should never take lightly the blessing of being included in the hope of Israel. We should treasure that calling by living lives which declare that we also have the name of God named upon us. So let's be thankful, brothers and sisters, for that calling. And let's be grateful for the story of a man of whom Scripture would say, "And Yahweh blessed the house of Obed-Edom and all that he had."